every teenager growing up at some point or another has snuck out of the house without their parents knowing, whether that was just to go hang out with friends, meet up with a girl, meet up with a boy. And most of the times, they really do not think twice about it, even though it can be incredibly dangerous sneaking out of the house at night. But for the teen in today's story, when he snuck out of his house to go meet up with his girlfriend, what happened was absolutely terrifying and it shook him to his very core. But before we get into that encounter, if you've had an encounter or know a story you'd like to have shared here on the show, please email me at the link below. If you like today's story, gently slap that like button. And if you haven't done so already, especially if you're a return viewer, hit that subscribe button. While you're at it, grab the notification bell, drive it out to your favorite place in the country, dance with it in the headlights so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounter. In the early 2000s, Kenny was just your typical high school senior. He did all the typical stuff that a lot of teenage boys at the time would do. When he wasn't in school, he was working on his car or he was hanging out with his friends, playing video games, going to the mall, just typical teenage stuff. Now, Kenny, though, was a little bit different. His best friend was not one of the guys. His best friend was actually his neighbor named May. Kenny knew May ever since he was about 4 years old, and their families both had these pretty large properties that were about a quarter section of land each, so about a half a mile by a half a mile. And right at the back of Kenny's parents' property, just on the other side of the fence, was May's parents' property. So these two grew up together. They were completely inseparable, and pretty much wherever one would go, the other would follow. And that bond, that closeness, rang solid through their entire lives, pretty much from the time they had met. These two were very similar in a lot of ways. They both enjoyed the outdoors. In the summertime, they would go exploring through their parents' property. They would go on hikes. They would go camping. They would go fishing together. The families all together would go camping. They would go on trips together. In the wintertime, both of them are really into snowmobiling. So they would go snowmobiling together. And they were just completely inseparable. Although, even though they were so close and so inseparable, they really never developed any feelings for each other, never really started dating or anything like that. But that all changed at the start of senior year. It was almost like somebody flipped a switch and both of them realized, hey, you know what? They're pretty great and I'm starting to feel things for them. So they ended up talking and they actually ended up becoming officially boyfriend and girlfriend. And at first, their parents were completely thrilled because these two families were pretty inseparable themselves. And both sets of parents were basically thinking that, these two are so close, chances are they're probably going to get married when they're older. We cannot see them breaking up. Like they're best friends, they have been all their lives. So life for Kenny and for May was really good. They had a lot of freedom because both sets of parents trusted the other. So they were allowed to basically go out whenever they wanted. They did not need to explain themselves. If they wanted to stay out late, they could. But that all changed a few months later. There was actually a big blow up between May's parents and Kenny's parents. And at that point, it was like that family bond that those two families had. It was like it just disintegrated, even though there were so many years of these families going away on trips and stuff together. This incident just completely shattered that bond between them. And both sets of parents very quickly kind of became against Kenny and May dating, almost like a Romeo and Juliet type thing. Like they were not forbidden to see each other, but they were also not really welcome at each other's houses. On top of that, these two were no longer able to just go whenever they wanted or stay out as long as they wanted with each other. They had to tell their parents where they were going, what time they would be back. And it was a real culture shock for these two because they never had to do that before. They grew up being able to hang out with each other as much as they wanted, as late as they wanted. So they were having a hard time accepting these new rules. But over the next few weeks and over the next few months, those new rules slowly started to become the norm, and they really did slowly start to accept that. But at the same time, they were kind of trying to rebel as well. They really wanted to see each other whenever they wanted. They did not want to have to explain themselves. They wanted to stay out late. They really missed being able to spend as much time with each other as they used to. So they started to develop a plan on how they would be able to go hang out with each other pretty much all night without their parents ever knowing. And they came up with this big plan that they would sneak out of the house, they would meet in the middle of the two properties, right where the two properties connected, right at the property line, and they would actually make a campsite. They would set up a tent, they could go there, they could spend the night with each other, and then early in the morning they could make their way back to their houses, sneak in, and their parents would never know they were there. So these two, they started to put this plan into progress. They ended up meeting in the middle of the two properties. They ended up clearing out a whole bunch of brush. They made almost the perfect campsite. They brought a bunch of stuff out to it. They brought a bunch of rocks to make a fire pit so they can have a fire together. They brought out a tent. They set it up. They put a big tarp over the top just as extra protection for the tent. And they thought that their plan was perfect. They thought their parents would never find out. And they were really excited to go to this tent and spend a night together for the very first time. Over the next couple of weeks, though, whenever they did not have school, the weather was not really cooperative. They would plan to sneak out of their house, but it would be pouring rain or it'd be really strong winds, and it would be really hard to walk a half mile through the bush and sneak back into the house with nobody knowing. So they had to keep putting this off. But the two of them, they kept their eyes on the forecast. And sure enough, there was a Friday night coming up where the weather would be absolutely perfect. It was going to be clear skies, no rain, very light breeze. And the two of them, when they saw this, are like, this is the night that we're going to test out this tent. So they started making their plan for that Friday night. Once Friday night came, both of them around 10 o'clock, they said goodnight to their parents. They both headed up to their rooms. They waited a little bit. They heard their parents go to bed a short time later. And then they both knew that this plan was on. Kenny, while he was in his room, he heard his parents go off to bed. So he slowly got up out of his bed. He reached underneath. He pulled out a backpack. He put it on. Very quietly opened up his window, stepped up onto his bed, jumped outside, and then once he was on the ground, he reached up, he very quietly and slowly closed his window. Then he started making his way towards the bush line behind his parents' house. Once he got into the bush line, he pulled a flashlight out from his pocket and he started walking that half mile to where that tent was set up. The entire time, as he was walking towards where the tent was, he had his flashlight up, he's looking into the trees. He was feeling a little uneasy, even though he spent a lot of time in the woods behind his parents' house. He didn't really walk around in them solo that often in the dark. And there were a fair number of bears in the area. There was even coyotes. So he was a little bit on edge of predators, but at the same time, he grew up in the country, so he was fairly used to it. But again, being solo, walking a half mile into the woods, completely unarmed, that's enough to make pretty much anybody feel a little bit uneasy. So, Kenny, as he's making his way through the trees, he can feel his heart rate picking up. He does feel himself on edge. But very slowly, all of a sudden, he starts to get up closer towards the property line. He sees the tent come into view and he knows that soon May will be there. And that kind of got him through it. It got him to basically shake off his fear. Once he got to the tent, he unzipped it, he put his backpack in, and then he went about gathering up a bunch of sticks and a bunch of twigs to make a fire. He slowly got a fire going. Once the fire was going, he went into the tent. He actually went in, zipped it up because the mosquitoes at this time were actually pretty bad. He was not counting on that. When he made his fire, he was getting eaten alive, and he did not bring bug spray because it's just something he did not think of. So while he was in the tent waiting for May, he grabs his phone, sends her a text just saying, "Bring bug spray, the bugs are bad." He puts his phone back into his bag, and then he just laid there listening to the sounds of nature all around him, listening to the fire crackle outside. After a little bit of time had passed, he realized May should have texted me back by now. So he opens up his backpack, pulls his phone back out, looks, and he had no text messages from her. So at this point, he was wondering, okay, she has to have been walking here already. Maybe that's why she didn't get the text. So he really did not think much of it. He took his phone, he put it back in his backpack, he lied back on the sleeping bag, and he just continued to wait for May to show up. After about 10 minutes, she still had not showed up, but he did very slowly behind him back in the direction of May's house start to hear what sounded like footsteps coming through the woods closer and closer towards the tent, and he thought that had to be May. So he very slowly sat up, listening to these footsteps that got closer and closer and closer to camp. And at one point, these footsteps stopped pretty much right behind the tent. He sat there listening. He did not hear any more footsteps. So he started to wonder, like, what the hell is she doing? Why is she just standing there behind the tent? She knows I'm here. I'm obviously here. The fire's going. So at this point, he called out to her. He said, May, is that you? And there was no response. He sat there for a few seconds thinking, okay, this has to be her. She's just messing with me. So he called out again. He said, May, what are you doing? Come on, get in the tent. The bugs are going to eat you alive. And again, there was no response. At this point, Kenny was getting a little bit frustrated. He thought for sure this was May. She's just messing with him. But at the same time, he was a little bit annoyed because she was not responding to him. So again, he called out to her. He said, May, what are you doing? And as soon as he said that, he heard where those footsteps had stopped behind him. Also, he heard footsteps start to run circles around the front of the camp. As he's listening to this, he's wondering, what the hell is she doing? So he again yells out to her. He yells, May, what are you doing? And there's again no response whatsoever. So he reaches into his backpack, he grabs a flashlight, makes his way to the front of the tent, starts to unzip it. And as soon as he started to move the zipper, also where those footsteps had stopped, those footsteps started running deeper into the woods. At this point, he's thinking that she's just playing a game with him. She must want him to chase her. So he quickly unzips the rest of the tent, steps out, stands up, he turns on his flashlight, starts shining it into the trees, and he cannot see her anywhere. So he makes his way past the fire right up towards where the thicker bush starts, shining his light in. He's looking around, and he cannot hear her running anymore. He can't see her. So he yells out to her. He yells, May, this isn't funny. Get back here. I'm not playing this game with you. Come on. You're wasting time. And again, though, there was just no response. So Kenny slowly makes his way into the bush. He starts going 10, 20, 30 yards in the entire time with his flashlight up, looking into the woods, and still no sign of her whatsoever. Kenny was now starting to get really annoyed. She was obviously messing with him. She wanted to play a game, but she was wasting time, and he was just not in the mood to go running through the woods in the dark. So he turned around, he made his way back to camp, went inside the tent. Once he was in the tent, he grabbed his phone out of his pack. He figured, you know what, I'm just going to text her. I'm going to say, okay, enough with this, just come to the tent. So he sent her a quick text. He waited a couple of minutes and there was no reply. At this point, he could hear those footsteps starting to make their way closer back to camp. And he decided to, you know what, enough with the text, enough with calling out. He opened up his phone and he actually ended up calling her. The phone only rang twice before somebody answered on the other end, except the voice that answered was not May's. It was actually May's father. When Kenny heard May's dad's voice, he basically completely froze. He was a little bit confused why May's dad was answering the phone because he had never answered her cell phone before. When all of a sudden her dad started to speak, and all he said was, I'm sorry, Kenny, May will not be joining you tonight. I caught her sneaking out. Please do not call again. And then he hung up the phone. Kenny sat there just completely confused, completely baffled, wondering how she got caught. He was feeling a little bummed that she was not going to be joining him that night. But then all of a sudden, he remembered those footsteps. At this point, Kenny felt his heart rate starting to pick up because those footsteps that he had heard were definitely not animal footprints. It was definitely not from a coyote. It was not from a bear. It was definitely bipedal. It was on 2 feet. And he was absolutely terrified. He had no idea who was out in the woods with him. And he just basically sat in the tent, just staring out the flap towards the fire. Kenny sat there for a couple of seconds, trying to figure out what he was going to do, running different thoughts through his head. Like, was this maybe one of his parents? Was it a buddy? Did one of their friends find out and they're just messing with them? But at the same time, he had other thoughts running through his head, like, what if this is some type of crazy person? What if this person followed us into the woods one day, found our camp, and they were waiting for us to come back? So he was trying to figure out what he was going to do next, when all of a sudden he heard May's voice from across a fire over into the woods where those footsteps had run. And her voice just said, Kenny, come here. I'm over here. When he heard this voice, his blood ran cold because he knew May's dad very well. And May's dad would not tell him that she was stuck in her room, that she had got caught sneaking out, and that she wouldn't be joining him if it was not true. He would not lie, no matter how mad he was at him. He would not lie to him. So now Kenny's trying to figure out who the hell this is and why the hell do they sound like my girlfriend. As he's sitting there processing everything in his head, he starts to realize that the area is completely silent. There's no more sounds of bugs, there's no more sounds of anything at all. And then he hears those footsteps start to move even closer. And again, he hears May's voice call out to him. The exact same thing as before, just, Kenny, I'm over here, come here. And he felt his heart rate again start to pick up even more. He was completely frozen in fear. He sat there staring out the tent flap, really not knowing what to do. And every footstep that came closer and closer towards the camp, he felt his anxiety and his fear start to raise even more. Now, he was completely unarmed and he knew he really had nothing to protect himself. He had a backpack with some snacks and some drinks, and that was pretty much about it. Like, if whatever this thing was or whoever this was came into camp, his only type of defense would be to grab this backpack and pretty much throw it at it. It was completely useless. And he knew that he was in a very dangerous situation right now, that there was somebody or something moving towards camp, and he was completely unarmed. After a few more seconds of hearing those footsteps come closer and closer and hearing May's voice call out again and again, all of a sudden, across the fire, up along the bush line, he starts to catch a little bit of movement. Once he sees this movement, he kind of instinctively kind of leaned forward, looking further out that flap, trying to get a little bit of a better look at whatever this was, when all of a sudden from behind this one big pine tree, this real small, emaciated, but super tall humanoid like creature kind of came creeping around the tree, looking directly at him. He got a pretty good look at this thing's face. It had dark, sunken in eyes, it had a massive mouth, and this thing was looking directly at him. Kenny just sat there completely frozen in fear, basically eyes locked right on this thing, when all of a sudden this thing opened its mouth and it was May's voice coming out of it. Upon seeing this, it was like it broke that trance from Kenny. Kenny was no longer basically paralyzed with fear. As soon as he saw that, it gave him that oomph, that adrenaline kick to actually get his butt moving and kick himself into gear. And he found himself very quickly scurrying out of the tent. He stood up, he turned, and he just started blind sprinting through the woods in the dark. He had no flashlight on him, no nothing. He was just running through the trees in the pitch black. Kenny sprinted through the trees, constantly thinking that this thing was going to get up behind him. And he could actually hear this thing running behind him. He could hear it almost, it sounded like he was climbing up on trees, jumping from one tree to another. And he kept hearing this thing calling his name. The entire time, Kenny was figuring this is the end for him. He figured this is how I'm going to die. Whatever this thing is, it's going to get me and I'm going to be gone. But this thing never got really more than about 20 yards from him. It was like almost like it was staying within that 20-yard gap behind him, and it never really closed in on him. He never really gained distance on this thing. And eventually, as he ran through the trees, slowly his house lights started to come into view. As soon as he started to see his house lights, then he noticed that the sound of this creature behind him sounded like it was starting to get further and further behind him. As soon as he broke the bush line, he basically just sprinted right up to his house and he started banging on the door. After banging on the door for a few seconds, his dad answered the door and was completely confused why Kenny is standing outside, why his son is drenched in sweat, and why he looks absolutely terrified. And Kenny was forced to tell his dad the story. He was forced to tell him that he snuck out of the house to go meet up with May, told him exactly what had happened. And his father did not really believe him. And he ended up telling Kenny just to go to his room and they would deal with it in the morning. The next morning, over breakfast, again, they went over what had happened. And now Kenny's dad was starting to believe parts of his story. He did not really believe this weird, emaciated, pale humanoid creature, but he did believe him that there was somebody or something out of the woods because his son was obviously shaken up. So Kenny's dad ended up calling over to May's dad, told him what Kenny had told him, and it actually ended up kind of working out for Kenny and for May because their parents figured, you know what, our kids are going to see each other anyway. They're sneaking out, they're meeting in the woods. It's dangerous out of the woods. There's predators, there's bears, there's coyotes, and now there's some person out on the property as well. You know what? Let's put our differences aside for our kids. Let's lift these rules. Let's let them see each other whenever they want so they do not need to feel the urge to go sneak out into the woods to go see each other. So it did end up working out to their advantage. However, Kenny and May, they kind of lost a little bit of their love for walking through the bush, going on their hikes, because May truly did believe Kenny's story. Even to this day, all these years later, Kenny and May, they've since gotten married, they've had a couple of kids, and Kenny still, every time he's out in the woods, especially at dark, he does feel incredibly uneasy. So the two of them, they don't do a lot of camping anymore. They still do hikes, they do take their children on hikes, but it's only in well populated parks and it's only during the day. Well, that's it for today's encounter. Let me know your thoughts on this. What do you think this was that Kenny encountered out in the woods? Do you think this was a Windigo? Do you think it was a palecrawler, a rake, maybe even a skinwalker? I'd really love to know your thoughts. But as always, thanks for joining us. If you haven't done so already, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.